There's a thing I'm sure you've heard of called the cycle of violence, right? Blood follows blood, as they say. And to some extent, the same thing can be said for societies, right? When you have one, let's say, group of oppressed people under the boot of a much more powerful and foreign oppressor, right? The society has to quickly adapt, right? And it has to, especially if its armies can't face the armies of its enemies in the field, well, it has to come up with creative ways to fight. And there have been many famous, guerrilla warriors, as we like to call them today, throughout history. There was Che Guevara, Mao. There was that guy in the American Revolution. I can't remember his name right now, the Swamp Fox. And before all of them, right, there was a guy whose name I'm pretty sure you haven't heard. And we'll get to him. But he's going to come up with a way to fight the Romans in Celtiberia that is going to inspire others in the future. And in particular, someone we're going to cover later in the season, to change up their tactics when it came to the Roman legions. And this cut and run style of fighting, well, it's going to be a problem for the legions for decades from this point forward. I'm not going to tell you his name yet because I want you to find it out in the episode, but we're going to talk about the continuation of the Celtiberian Wars today on courage and conflict. Lucius Licinius Lucullus. That's a name I want you to remember, right? It's going to play a huge part in the first part of today's story. Now, Lucius Licinius Lucullus, try to say that name 3 times fast, was the sort of man described in historical text as being greedy for fame and glory. Now, I'm sure we've all seen people like this. They're all over the internet these days. People who will do anything, to bring the sort of attention on themselves that, they can bask in the adoration of their peers, right? The kind of people who would sell their own mothers for a coin, as the saying goes. And Lucius Licinius Lucullus is one of these people. Like I said, he's described as being greedy and fame hungry, right? And Lucius Licinius Lucullus is going to be elected consul, and he's going to be sent to Hispania to deal with the Celtiberian uprisings, right? But if you remember, when we left off yesterday, Marcellus had ended the war through a series of treaties and negotiations. He'd actually sent a delegation to Rome in order to argue out the, the two sides, those pro-Roman and anti-Roman sides. Got to argue it out in front of the Senate, and the Senate decided that, well, they didn't trust Marcellus. They thought Marcellus was greedy and fame-hungry. And there was the young Scipio Aemilianus, who stood up and excoriated his peers for not wanting to go to Hispania and fight. And so the Senate sends another army into Hispania and reinforcements for the army that Marcellus had in the far provinces. And Lucullus is going to show up to what, according to Marcellus, is an already wrapped up situation. Marcellus he'd exchanged some hostages, he'd negotiated a few quick treaties, and he'd warned the people that Lucullus was coming with another army. And the Celtiberians, though they had seen some initial victories in the First Celtiberian War, by this point they were, by all accounts, ready to make peace. So when Lucullus shows up to Hispania, Marcellus already has everything wrapped up nice and tidy. The war is over, and everything's going to be okay. But see, Lucullus, like I said, he was a real asshole. He was fame-hungry. He was a glory hound. And he had all these men with him who were just itching for conflict. And he had heard that Hispania was rich with gold and precious metals. Now, like I said yesterday, Hispania was a rich province and it had lots of trade, but some of these Celtic tribes, tribesmen, some of these little petty kingdoms, some of these cultures, they didn't even value gold and silver the way the Romans did. They had a different concept of wealth. But Lucullus has heard rumors that Hispania is, stacked to the gills, as they say, with gold. And he's ready for some of that conquest. And so when he shows up and Marcellus has everything in hand, this must have been really irritating for a man like Lucullus, because he was ready for war. And whether the Celtiberians liked it or not, Lucullus was going to bring them war. Now, according to some of the historical texts, Lucullus was he was in what they describe as straitened circumstances. Maybe he was strapped for gold and he had debts to pay in Rome, but he needed to return to Rome with money. You get the real sense that Lucullus needs this conquest, right? In ancient Rome, for politicians, wealth was more of a means to an end. You didn't gather wealth and resources so you could pass it down to your children and they could invest in their own retirement plans. That wasn't what a politician did with money in Rome. Money was used to, pay bribes, to put on games, to spread gold around amongst your followers so that you had more support. And you get the real sense reading about this war that Lucullus may have been in some dire circumstances back home. Maybe he had, spread a few too many, maybe he'd made too many promises to the people who had helped him get elected. And now that he is in Hispania at the head of an army, he's got to do something to pay those debts. And so Lucullus finds this town called Calca, and he marches on this town and encamps outside of the town. And this is inhabited by a tribe called the Vaccii. And the Vaccii they had never attacked the Romans, right? They weren't even part of the fighting that had gone on in the region. And so Lucullus camps outside the walls, and the town sends some representatives out to say, hey, what are you doing here? What's going on? What do you want? Lucullus replies that the Vaccii had mistreated the Carpetani, and he was going to come to their aid. If you remember, the Carpetani are these equestrians who were sort of benighted by the Senate to be tax collectors. And they would basically go around pillaging all the towns and the farms, etc., under the guise of collecting taxes for Rome. And they were collecting taxes. But they were also allowed to basically skim off the top. Anything they collected beyond the amount they were required to gather for Rome, they were allowed to keep. And as you can imagine, this is basically just a license to loot. But the Vaccii had, never done anything to the Carpetani. This was this was described in the text that I have read as being just a lie. This was just Lucullus's public reason, the thing that he told them, when what he really wanted, as you'll see, is conquest. So the townspeople decide to attack some of the Roman foragers. Now, ancient armies back then, they had to send people out to gather food for the army. Feeding a legion is not an easy feat. And so a lot of times armies would forage from the surrounding countryside, and this would involve mostly just going to local farms and things like that and just taking what they had. These would be just as much resource gathering missions as they would be probably just the early opening salvos of the skirmishes to come. This was the army, burning and looting in the very earliest stages of the fight. At least in my mind, I can't imagine this happening any other way. And so the Vaccii send some people out to attack these Roman foragers, and they are initially successful. And they're able to kill a good number of the Romans, but they were sort of equipped as light infantry. And you could imagine maybe some thin, they probably weren't even armored very well. And they were described as having darts. And these were probably javelins or some similar weapon that were, these were common in the area at the time. And once the Vaccii soldiers ran out of darts to throw, they were routed, basically, and chased back to the city. And the Vaccii people were inclined at this point to make peace because, they knew they couldn't beat the Romans. So Lucullus demands a tribute. He demands like cavalry and a bunch of, he demands a bunch of money, and this is given to him. And then when the Vaccii give him, when they meet these demands, he says, well, you know what? I've changed my mind. I want the town to be garrisoned by Roman soldiers. So when the people agree to this, they really had no choice but to agree to this. Lucullus picks 2,000 of his men and orders them to seize the city. And when they do, they let the rest of the Roman army in, who, under Lucullus's orders, slaughter every adult male in the city. Now, it's written that only a few out of about 20,000 Celtiberians survived this slaughter. And this is another, you see this in the last Celtiberian War, at almost every battle that the Celtiberians lose, at least 20,000 soldiers die on the battlefield. Now, this, of course, wasn't a battlefield. This was a slaughter of the people who had already surrendered and met Rome's terms. But like I said, Lucullus is hungry for fame and glory and wealth, most of all. And so the few people who escaped this slaughter, they're able to burn some supplies so that Lucullus isn't able to just gather up the wealth that they'd left behind. And after this, Lucullus decides to march deeper into Hispania. And he goes to another city called Arcadia. Lucullus's attack on Arcadia isn't quite as successful as his initial push into the region. According to what I've read, there was a sizable army at Arcadia, something like 20,000 infantry and a few hundred cavalry, like 800 to 1,000 cavalry, maybe more. And they had taken refuge inside the walls of Arcadia. And now news of Lucullus's slaughter of the Chalci, the people in the city of Chalca, had reached the Itercadians. And they, when Lucullus showed up, Lucullus demanded peace talks from the city. And so the Itercadians, they send representatives to the Roman camp, and they reproach Lucullus for his slaughter. And they ask him if they mean to do the same thing to them. And Lucullus, in classic asshole fashion, Lucullus gets pissed off and starts to go around burning and raiding the local farms outside the city. And he lines his army up for battle multiple times, trying to bait the Itercadians into leaving the safety of their walls and attacking. But the Itercadians just refuse to engage. And, you can imagine how this goes. The siege happens. It goes on for days and days. And there are stories about this large sort of, imposing Celtiberian soldier. Just imagine some big scary dude who would regularly go out into the space between the armies and try to bait one of the Romans into single combat. And for a long time, none of the Romans would answer this challenge until the young Scipio Aemilianus. Remember him from last episode? This young noble who had excoriated his fellow peers for their unwillingness to fight, decides to take up the challenge. And he meets this huge guy in single combat, and though Scipio Aemilianus is described as being a small man, he's able to win this duel, which lifts the spirits of the Romans, at least for a short time. But then a cavalry contingent that had been out away from the city before Lucullus had arrived returned, and they find the Romans there encamped around the city. And so in the text, it's kind of hard to understand what happens next, because the way they describe it, they say that this cavalry regiment rode about shouting and raising a ruckus. And then the people inside the city also started shouting, and this scared the shit out of the Romans. And that's kind of hard to picture. But what I imagine happened is, perhaps this town is surrounded by forests or something similar. And then, just imagine at night if you are a Roman soldier that's besieging this town in a strange land far from home. And then all these cries raise up out of the forest and then out of the city as well. And, other periods of Roman history have described events like this happening to other armies. There's an event that happens to the consular army of Gaius Marius, later on in the history of Rome, when they're fighting the Teutons and the Cimbri. And the description of that event is similar, where the Roman army is encamped in this forest and they're surrounded at night. And all throughout the night, they just hear these ghostly cries rising from the forest. These screams, these war screams. And in my mind, I can't help but hear the the opening scream to "Immigrant Song" by Led Zeppelin. That's the way I picture it in my head. And so all these Celtiberians start raising this ruckus, and this scares the Romans. And the Romans are suffering from some other problems in Lucullus's camp. One main one being that they weren't used to the local food, and so a lot of them are getting dysentery. And many Romans are dying from this dysentery. And that was a common problem in ancient armies. Just imagine dying from basically shitting your guts out. Well, a bunch of Romans are dealing with this problem. And, they attack the walls again, and the Romans are rebuffed from the walls. And, they built some siege works. They were able to knock down a wall, and they attacked, but they were rebuffed. And since they fled and they didn't know the area, a bunch of the Roman soldiers fled into a reservoir, basically fell into a reservoir and died. So the Romans lose another sizable portion of their army. And finally, Scipio Aemilianus decides to negotiate a peace. And he promises the Itercadians that this peace will be inviolate. That Lucullus is not going to turn around and betray the peace the way he had done before with the Caucaei. And so they do that. They negotiate a peace. The Itercadians send Lucullus some cloaks and some cattle and some gold as part of the agreement, and Lucullus's army turns away. The rest of Lucullus's war against the Vaccii doesn't go very well for him. He attacks a town called Pollentia, and Pollentia was known in the region for having a population of very brave fighters, right? They were known for being scrappy. So Lucullus, he camps outside of Pollentia, and he tries to play the same game with the Pallanteans as he did with the Itercadians and the Chalcidians before them. And the Pallanteans are having none of it. They attack the Roman foragers. They drive the Roman army off into the night, and Lucullus is forced to flee. And they ultimately pursue him all the way back to the river Darius. And Lucullus has to retreat into some allied lands and make winter camps. And this is the end of his illegal war against the Vaccii. And even the Roman Senate describes it as an illegal war, though, as you have seen so far, the Senate didn't pay much attention to what was happening in the provinces. And even they had said that this war in Celtiberia was illegal. But as far as the gold and the wealth that Lucullus was seeking, according to Appian, he got nothing. The quote in Appian's writing goes something like, "Of the gold and silver that supposedly abounded in Hispania, Lucullus got none." Not only did these tribes have none, but they also didn't value these metals. Which is, it certainly wouldn't be better if Lucullus had also taken an astounding amount of wealth away from these people. But also, it almost makes it worse that all these Celtiberians, thousands and thousands of Celtiberians, had to die for absolutely nothing. For the greed of a Roman politician who, in the end, got nothing. Right? Lucullus committed a crime similar to that of Caesar, right? Caesar did similar things in Gaul during his famous march through the region. He attacked one tribe, on barely any justification. He made alliances. He got this tribe to attack that tribe, and that's basically what's going on in Hispania over this 100-year span of war in the region. But nobody really remembers the name Lucius Licinius Lucullus. Right? In all his, quest for fame, he's barely a footnote in the histories. Now, while Lucullus is making his winter camp in what is known as Turdetania, there's another army in Hispania, in the farther provinces, who are fighting a group of people called the Lusitanians. And the Lusitanians had, kind of been raiders in their history, like a lot of these tribes did. They were, they'd traveled around, they'd fought for Carthage at one point, they'd traveled into North Africa and fought there, and they had fought the Romans in the past. Right, Rome first sort of pushed into this region in like 194 or something, And some historians have wrote that they had subdued tribes in that region. But in 155, a Lusitanian rebellion breaks out. And they besiege a bunch of Romans inside of a city, and they kill, some Roman official. And there is a Roman praetor who is in charge of the forces in farther Spain, who's named Servius Galba. And if anything, Servius Galba is even more greedy and fame-hungry than Lucullus. So Galba rushes to the aid of the Romans in the city, but he's defeated. He loses something like, 7,000 or 8,000 of his men, and he's forced to make camp himself. And some of these fighters must have made their way, toward the winter camp of Lucullus, but Lucullus discovers some of these fighters, and he and Galba decide to invade Lusitania. Perhaps Lucullus had tired of trying to attack the other Celtiberians, but he invades Lusitania, and Galba invades from the opposite direction, and they do sort of a pincer move through Lusitania, bringing war to the people who lived there. And the way this is described in the text is that they gradually depopulated the area. Now, whether that means they, won a whole bunch of battles, or whether that means they were just going through and committing some sort of systematic genocide, take your pick. But it is written in the text that they gradually depopulated the area. And so this is going to happen right in conjunction with the Second Celtiberian War. So what I want you to understand about the region is that it is a series of conflicts that flare up, in this place and in that place. And some tribes, they hear about the rebellions and they decide to join the rebellion. Some fight for the Romans because the Romans make treaties with them. And sometimes hostages are taken from these tribes and held against the tribe's compliance with the Roman treaties. So this is a complicated cultural blanket of peoples who have made a web of treaties with one another, with the Romans, some who have surrendered, some who fought for the Romans, some tribes are fighting each other. I don't want you to think of the Celtiberians as being one people. There were many, many peoples in this region. The Lusitanians were one of them. And they caught the ire of Servius Galba and Lucullus. And as a result of this, they would fight for a while and things would kind of come to a head. The Lusitanians would agree to a peace. And Servius Galba laid out a plan in order to settle some of these Lusitanian fighters on lands, right? And he convinced them to divide themselves into three, and he would grant them, these lands that he had promised. But instead of doing that, he approached each group separately, and he dug a huge trench around the area where they were camped. And he would approach them, convince them to lay down their arms, at which point a slaughter would ensue. And in this way, Servius Galba killed most of these Lusitanian fighters, but one man would escape. And that man would go on to raise a rebellion and fight the Romans like no one in the region had done before. In 148 BC, the Lusitanians are able to gather another sizable force, and they attack Tertulliania. This is the same place that, if you remember, Lucullus had made camp in the previous years. And a man named Vitellius, who was the commander of the Roman forces at the time, he rushed out to meet them, and he was able to defeat the Lusitanians. And in the course of negotiating a peace treaty with them, he made them promises that were eerily similar to those that Galba had made the Lusitanians before, right, when he had offered them lands in exchange for their surrender. And so the Lusitanians are talking this offer over, and there's a young warrior amongst them who speaks up and says that the Romans are not to be trusted, because he's witnessed Galba's treachery firsthand. He was one of the few who escaped that slaughter, and his name was Viriathus. Now, Viriathus must have been a charismatic sort of guy, because all of these Lusitanians decide to elect him as their new leader. And Viriathus comes up with an intelligent plan to escape these Romans. He decides to array the army up for battle like they mean to fight, in order to bait Vitellius into attacking. But instead of attacking, he orders his men to scatter in every direction, and then to regroup at the nearby city of Tripolis, behind the walls there, safe out of range of the Romans. And he promises to hold the Romans at bay with 1,000 of his best warriors. So he lines up his men to fight. Viriathus and his men, advance on the Romans as if to give battle, and so the Romans attack Viriathus directly. And then the rest of his army scatters. And then through a series of skirmishes over the next 2 days, Viriathus is able to use guerrilla tactics. These hit and run sort of attacks against the Romans, and he delayed Vitellius' advance, giving his army time to regroup in Tripolis. Now, the Roman army at this time, this was before the Marian reforms, so they fought in maniples. You'd have 3 major parts of the army, at least the infantry, and those were the Hastati, the Principes, and the Triarii. The Hastati were like the youngest and most inexperienced soldiers in the legion, right? They fought with the gladius and, the big curved shield, but oftentimes the only armor they'd have would be like a helmet, maybe a really crude breastplate. In some cases, perhaps, if they were really wealthy, maybe they'd have a suit of mail, but it was doubtful. Now, next behind them would fight the Principes, and the Principes were a little more experienced. They were older soldiers. They'd probably seen a few campaigns, and they had better equipment. They had heavier armor, basically. And behind these Principes were the Triarii, and the Triarii were spearmen. They fought in a formation similar to a Greek phalanx, right? A shield wall and a hedgerow of spears. Now, the Romans, they enjoyed using their conquered peoples as auxiliary troops. So a lot of times they would source their cavalry and their ranged skirmishers from their allied tribes, right? So they might be fighting with, Numidian cavalry at the time. Numidian cavalry was known in the ancient world at the time to be the best cavalry on the battlefield. And, they would have war elephants, like they had those war elephants in the Celtiberian Wars for Massinissa that had rampaged and trampled so many Romans. And so these guerrilla tactics that Viriathus would employ against them, Viriathus, they were kind of baffling to the Roman army at the time. They didn't have a lot of quick reaction troops that could, stick and move and pursue these fleeing Lusitanians. And in this way, Viriathus was able to, cut and run and allow his men time to regroup at Tripolis. Now, Vitellius, of course, gave chase. But Viriathus was able to give his people time to prepare. And so the Lusitanians prepared an ambush for Vitellius and his men. And in the ensuing battle, 6,000 Romans were slain, and the legion under Vitellius had only about 10,000 men. So that's, 60% are dead right there on the battlefield. And the rest of them managed to escape, and the remaining leaders, because Vitellius himself was killed in the ambush. And there's a funny line, well, maybe it's not funny, but there's a line in the histories that says that he was considered of low value as a slave because he was old and fat. So they killed him. Now, the remaining Romans are able to escape, and they ask for aid from neighboring tribes. And 2 of them respond. But the thing is, Viriathus' victory, news of it spread to neighboring Celtic tribes, and they all began to join his cause. Some of the writings in the histories, they describe Viriathus as sort of this mythical, heroic figure. I think someone even referred to him as like a Homeric era hero returned from the dead. So his legend was growing, and this, of course, caused other tribes to defect and join his side. And so these 2 allied Roman tribes, they were all slain in skirmishes against the Lusitanians and their allies. And so Viriathus' star was rising quickly, and all at the expense of Rome. Now, the next year in 146, Rome sends another legion, another 10,000 men, to try and put down Viriathus' rebellion. But he's unable, right? He's defeated by Viriathus. And Viriathus just goes on to raid farther Spain unchecked for the whole year, right? And for context, this is the same year that Rome burns Carthage to the ground, right? This is the year that Rome puts its final nail in the coffin of its major rival on the world stage, right? So in some respects, Rome is, taking that next step up on the ladder to being the world power, right? At least in the ancient Mediterranean world. And so at the same time they are winning this massive war against Carthage, they're losing in the provinces to Viriathus. And so the next year, the Senate sends Fabius Maximus into Hispania with another army, and Viriathus is able to sort of hold him off with these same cut-and-run guerrilla tactics, right? He holds him off for another year, until the next year, Maximus is able to attack Viriathus, bring him into a decisive battle and put him to flight, right? And he's able to capture 2 of his cities in the process. But he's unable to capture Viriathus. And at the end of his term, he's forced to go into winter camp in Cordoba and then return to Rome without having captured Viriathus. Now, the next year, the Roman general who succeeds Fabius Maximus is named Quintus Aulus. And Quintus Aulus tries and fails for an entire year to bring Viriathus to battle. And during this time, while Viriathus is fighting all these delaying actions and keeping the Romans busy, he's able to negotiate with other tribes that are allied to Rome and incite them into rebellion, right? And so a whole other conflict kicks off while Viriathus returns to fight Quintus Aulus. And he's able to attack Quintus and kill a bunch of his men and drive him into winter camps in the middle of autumn, right? And Quintus Aulus sends one of his subordinates to fight Viriathus while he waits in the winter camp. And so another year goes by for Rome without a decisive victory against Viriathus, and his star rises ever higher. So in 142, the Senate sends Fabius Maximus Servilianus, and this is not the same Fabius Maximus before Aulus. They send Fabius Maximus Servilianus to replace Quintus Aulus. And Servilianus comes with 2 new legions, a bunch of war elephants, and cavalry. He's armed to the gills with a whole new army to finally put the problem of Viriathus to rest, at least in the Senate's eyes. So he marches against Viriathus, and he's able to initially defeat him. But Viriathus is able to kill still like about 3,000 or 4,000 Romans and harass them on the way back to their camp. And initially the Romans are able to defend themselves, but Viriathus keeps up the pressure, and under constant attacks, the Romans are forced to retreat back to Ithaca. And rather than following them, Viriathus withdraws back into Lusitania. Fabius Maximus Servilianus, rather than follow Viriathus directly to give chase, takes sort of this roundabout route where he raids some of the allied towns to the Lusitanians on his way. But finally, he marches back into Lusitania. Now, on his way to attack Viriathus, Servilianus is ambushed by an army of about 10,000 led by 2 other Lusitanian commanders. Servilianus is victorious in this battle, and he goes on to take 3 more Lusitanian cities on his march to confront Viriathus. He captures thousands of men, right? He beheads a bunch of them, and he sells the rest into slavery, right? And I'm saying that very quickly, but he captures, it was over 10,000 men, right? He rolled 500 heads and then sold the rest into slavery, right? Just imagine, 9,000 or more slaves on the road back to Rome. What an insane sight that must be. So during the course of this war, after, capturing all these men and beheading the warriors, some of the warriors, his army decides to camp in a town called Erisana. And through some means of treachery, Viriathus is able to gain entry into the city and attack Servilianus there. And through this attack, he aims to negotiate a peace. They're able to fight inside the walls, defeat the armies of Fabius Maximus, and in so doing, he basically strong-arms the man into negotiating a peace treaty with his forces. And so Viriathus, through these guerrilla tactics and these constant delaying actions, he's able to harass the Romans for so long that they finally give him the peace that he's seeking. But given the Roman greed and the hunger for resources, it's not going to last very long. The next year, Fabius Maximus is succeeded by another Fabius Maximus, and this is the 3rd Fabius Maximus we've had in the story so far. Count on 3 Fabius Maximuses. So Fabius Maximus Capio complains to the Senate, and he says that this treaty with Viriathus is unworthy of Rome. Right? He doesn't like the insult to the new great power. Because remember, Rome had just defeated Carthage, right? It saw itself as, an unstoppable force on the world stage. The Roman pride, was really high at this point. So how could this barbarian, according to them, have held off Rome for so long? So at first the Senate's kind of weary of the wars because it's been fighting, remember, all over. At this point, it just finished the war with Carthage. It was fighting in Greece before this, and now, it seems like maybe the Senate is weary of all this fighting. But Capio convinces the Senate to let him fight secretly, so he kind of starts, fighting a little bit here and there, and finally the Senate agrees, okay, go ahead and go to war. So Maximus Capio marches into Lusitania, and he attacks a city of, I believe it was Arca, and he's able to take the city. He defeats Viriathus, and Viriathus is able to escape to Carpetani. Now, Viriathus at this point, it seems like he himself is weary of the war, because he's been fighting this guerrilla campaign against Rome for years and years and years at this point. He's had to deal with several new commanders and the exchange of power on the Roman side, and this must have been very taxing on him. It was said that Viriathus kind of slept in his armor, and he never slept for very long. But he had three trusted friends, and their names were Audax, Detalco, and Manurus. Right? These guys were like his lieutenants. Okay? And so, after he escapes, he gathers his closest friends, and he bade them to go to Capio and ask for peace. He wants to treat with the man to end the war rather than go on fighting. So he sends them to Capio, and Capio, in the classic Roman fashion, he denies them the peace that Viriathus is seeking, and instead he bribes them to assassinate Viriathus. And this is one of those classic Machiavellian moves, you know. If you can't win through military force, then you win through treachery. So these three lieutenants, Audax, Detalco, and Manurus, they return to Viriathus' camp. And remember what I said about how he rarely slept for long and always in his armor? Well, his three lieutenants had access to him at all times. He had like a standing order that his lieutenants could come and inform him of dire events, you know, no matter the hour. The commander's open door policy type thing. So, using this, you know, access, these three betrayers stole into Viriathus' tent, and they slit his throat while he slept. And thus fell one of the men who up to that point had fought one of the longest guerrilla campaigns against the Roman Empire, or the Roman Republic, I should say. Viriathus really showed that Rome could be fought. And in the morning, his army wakes up. They discover his death, and they're unable to figure out, who killed him. So they just have this big funeral. They throw like gladiator games, and they have races, and they have like this big ceremony to celebrate, what up to that point had probably been like one of their greatest leaders. Well, the three betrayers returned to Capio because, of course, they couldn't stay with Viriathus and the Lusitanians. I mean, not under threat of being discovered, of being the ones who had killed him, his three closest lieutenants, these betrayers. So they returned to Capio to ask him for, I suppose, asylum, and to ask him for their payment. But Capio had them seized and executed. And his justification for this was that Rome did not pay traitors. Viriathus, for me, is one of those figures who isn't often mentioned in, the history. If you are a history nerd like me, and you're a person who loves stories, you've probably gone through a lot of content on the internet. Maybe you've heard of a few interesting, foes of the Roman Republic. Hannibal comes to mind immediately because he's so famous, There is Mithridates and Pyrrhus and all these other people. But Viriathus is rarely mentioned, at least in a lot of the, what you might call the mainstream historical narratives. But to the Lusitanians, Viriathus was one of their greatest heroes. And there's a statue of him that's in Viseu in Portugal that you can go see if you're ever in Viseu in Portugal. Which, hey, if you are, take a photo and shoot it to me on Facebook. But his story, and I don't know if you've ever seen the show Spartacus, the Showtime show Spartacus. It was a really fun show back in the day. It was sort of done in the style of 300, and it was just a lot of, TNA and blood and really overdone combat and dramatic scenes. It was such a fun watch. And there's a scene in the last season of Spartacus, spoilers lie ahead, where one of the main characters dies, and they throw a big funeral with all these gladiatorial games and stuff, and it's considered this big event, and in the show it follows Spartacus's gladiator rebels, and so them doing these gladiatorial games to honor the passing of their brother, was like a big deal to them. And I kind of picture the funeral of Viriathus in the same way, right? The people, when they were unable to find his betrayers, they threw this big celebration to honor what he'd done for them. And even while, the wars are going to continue in the Iberian Peninsula, Viriathus was one of the most interesting figures to rise from this period of conflict. And after him, it's going to take a much darker turn. And we're going to talk about that next time. Thanks for coming with me today on this journey through the Second Celtiberian War and the uprising of Viriathus. If you enjoyed the story, please like, follow, subscribe, leave us a review. We'd love you for it. And if you're feeling squirrely, if you're a fan of dark stories, and in particular, the kind of hack and slash sword and sorcery that you might be starting to suspect that I love to write, then you can head over to my website at www.dwhawkins.com. Click the join tab and you can join my mailing list, and I'll send you 2 free fantasy books, plus some emails that discuss more dark stories from history. So, thanks for coming with me today, and I'll see you next time on Courage and Conflict.